Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Marta Helena. I am a University Associate Professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. I'm also a fellow at Selwyn College and a research associate at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence, or CFI, and former director of the Kinds of Intelligence program there, which is one of the topics I'll be discussing today. First, I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of the Alumni Festival for putting together this excellent series of events, and I'm really excited to take part in it. Thank you. So the focus of this talk is how to study the animal mind, so how to approach the study of animal minds. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to spend the first part of the talk introducing what I call the standard view of animal intelligence. I'll then argue that the standard view is more of a hindrance than a help when it comes to understanding the diversity and complexity of animal minds. And then I'll spend the rest of the talk proposing an alternative approach that's grounded in recent work on the evolution of cognition. This is the potential new periodic table of animal minds. That's the title of the talk. So we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes at the end of the session for Q&A. I'll wait to answer questions at the end of the talk during the Q&A, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this topic, which is an ongoing area of research. I should also mention that I have a dog in the background, so he's making a little noise. I hope that doesn't interrupt anything. We'll go on a walk after this talk. Okay, so let's begin. So I'd like to start with an introduction that illustrates the historical roots of what I will call the standard view. So these historical roots are often traced back to the 17th century with the French philosopher René Descartes. However, I'd like to look at an 18th century example, which I think illustrates the standard view well. This is the work of Johann Wolfgang von Kempelen. So Kempelen was born in the Kingdom of Hungary. He studied philosophy, worked as a civil engineer and a civil servant. And Kempelen was known for being a bit of a polymath. He spoke 8 languages, designed waterworks, directed salt mines, among other activities. But he's probably most well known for a machine that took him only 6 months to build. This machine has become one of the most famous ones in history. So this machine that Kempelen built was a mechanical chess player known as the Turk. It was famous for having chess playing abilities that surpassed even the strongest human players, and for the remarkable ability to flexibly adapt to new situations. This ability was remarkable because the mechanical Turk was, well, a machine. It was, as noted here, filled with wheels, cylinders, levers, and other pieces of clockwork. Despite being mechanical, this machine displayed flexible intelligence. It could beat most players, regardless of their strength and how diversely they played. To give one example of its flexibility, audience members were regularly invited to place the knight on any square on the board. The automaton would then solve the knight's tour, visiting every square on the board just once, starting from that position that the audience member chose. This is a difficult problem to solve and was of great interest to mathematicians at the time. The mechanical Turk could solve it, though, without knowing the starting position in advance. This people took as evidence of a profound ability to flexibly adapt to new situations. The mechanical Turk fascinated the world by achieving what seemed unachievable. How could a purely mechanical system, one made of cogs and levers, engage in sophisticated and flexible behavior? For many spectators and commentators, this was impossible. For example, one commentator, the English author Philip Thickness, wrote that an automaton may be made to move its hand, its head, and its eyes in certain and regular motions is past all doubt. But that an automaton can be made to move the chessmen properly as a sagacious player in consequence of the preceding move of a stranger who undertakes to play against it is also utterly impossible. To give one more example of a commentator, Robert Willis, one of the first Cambridge professors to be widely recognized as a mechanical engineer, wrote, quote, "The phenomenon of the chess player are, the mechanical Turk, are inconsistent with the effects of mere mechanism. For however great and surprising the powers of mechanism may be, the movements which spring from it are necessarily limited and uniform. It cannot usurp and exercise the faculties of mind. It cannot be made to vary its operations so as to meet the ever-varying circumstances of a game of chess. This is the province of intellect alone." So it turns out that these commentators here were right when it came to the mechanical Turk. The intelligent behaviors exhibited by this machine were, in fact, the results of a trick. Kempelen had created an ingenious set of compartments, functional mechanisms, and decoy mechanisms inside the cabinet on which the Turk played chess. Just go back to that image. This allowed a human to remain concealed inside the cabinet, despite the cabinet doors being open during the performance for all to see what was inside. It was this human that was playing chess and solving problems. What I want to highlight from the case of the mechanical Turk is this. There is a contrast being drawn between flexible intelligence on the one hand and simple mechanisms that result in limited and inflexible behavior on the other. I think this contrast has had a long-lasting effect. Namely, we still find it operating in research on animal cognition today. This is the core of the standard view, which I'll turn to now. Okay, so the idea that organisms can be divided into those that are intelligent on the one hand and those that follow simple mechanical procedures on the other is what I will refer to as the standard view of intelligence. Humans provide one example of biological intelligence. They adapt flexibly to new situations, solve a wide range of problems, engage in complex social situations, and more. Under the standard view, some organisms are like humans in that they can flexibly adapt to a highly variable environment by drawing on cognitive capacities such as imagination and causal reasoning. Such organisms are suitably characterized as intelligent. Oh. And here we have, as an example, a gorilla and a raven. Other organisms, however, are rigid in their behavior and rely on mechanisms such as innate behavioral programs and associative learning. This is according to the standard view. We can think of organisms one way or the other. Such organisms are not generally intelligent. They work well in some situations, really well in some situations, but break down when required to function outside of a narrow range of environments. Intelligent agents, in contrast, do not rely on such pre-programmed rules or brute force training to achieve their goals. We can see the standard view operating in comparative psychology. For example, in a review on intelligence in Corvid and Apes, the comparative psychologists Amanda Seed, Nathan Emery, and Nicole Clayton address the question, what is intelligence? In answering this question, they write, and here this is an excerpt from their paper. I'll let people take a look at this quote while I go ahead and take Benji outside because I think he needs to go outside. So one moment. You need to go outside. Okay, that's great. Okay, I think I didn't mute. Okay, sorry about that. We just went on a walk, but this is his normal walking time, so he decided he needs a second time outside. Okay, so let me get back to where I was. So these are comparative psychologists. This is a paper from 2009, and they write that ever since scholars began discussing animal intelligence, it has been a highly divisive issue and remains so today. At the poles of the debate are two opposite views concerning thinking in animals. The first, the origin of which is attributed to Descartes, is that animals are essentially mindless machines, with their behavior triggered wholly by external or internal stimuli. The other, most famously articulated by Darwin, is that the difference in mind between man and the higher animals is one of degree and not kind. So humans and animals are similar and not different in kind. So the crucial question is what role this dichotomy between mindless machines on the one hand and intelligent-minded creatures on the other plays in current scientific and philosophical debates on animal cognition and behavior. So due to time constraints, I won't go into the details here, but if you survey the literature in comparative cognition, today you find a common and consistent contrast between human-like intelligent behavior on the one hand and mechanical-like unintelligent behavior on the other. Like debates surrounding the mechanical Turk, human-like intelligent behavior is typically described as flexible and complex, while mechanical-like unintelligent behavior is described as inflexible, rigid, and simple. Moreover, it's often hypothesized that these differences in behavior can be tracked to differences in cognitive or neural mechanisms. Human-like intelligent behavior is regularly described as the product of cognitive mechanisms like imagination, causal reasoning, future planning, episodic memory, and others. In contrast, mechanical-like unintelligent behavior is typically viewed as the product of innate behavioral programs and associative learning. I again won't go into the details of these various mechanisms here, but I'm happy to discuss them in the Q&A. The important point is that these two categories, flexibly intelligent and mechanical, are still used to broadly guide theorizing on animal behavior. Researchers ask, is the octopus capable of sophisticated and flexible problem solving using future planning? Or is the octopus relying on associative learning to brute force a solution to a problem in a way that won't transfer to new situations? However, I and others believe this approach is misguided. There is a longer argument to be made here, but one reason why the standard view is misguided is that the mechanisms thought to underlie inflexible and simple behaviors, so these here, can actually lead to quite sophisticated behaviors. So I'd like to illustrate this with a few examples. So the first example is studies on domesticated mallard ducklings. So these studies, as well as studies on domesticated chicks, suggest that innate predispositions or innate priors lead to intelligent behavior. So for one example, in this study depicted here, researchers showed that newborn ducklings have the capacity to identify logical relations among objects and generalize these abstract relations to novel stimuli. So domesticated mallard ducklings were exposed to pairs of objects, as you can see here, about 1 hour after hatching. These objects were either the same in their color and shape, like these here, or different in one of these properties. Later, when presented with a new pair of objects, ducklings preferred those exhibiting the relation, same or different, to which they had been initially exposed, suggesting they had imprinted on the original abstract relation and were able to identify it in the new case. This and related studies suggest that simple mechanisms like the innate predisposition to imprint are sensitive to high-level patterns in the world, like abstract relations between objects. and can facilitate the transfer of knowledge of these patterns to new situations. They can generalize. What's more, so these innate preferences that are found in animals like ducklings and chicks, we have reason to think they're also quite prevalent in humans. For example, newly hatched domestic chicks show a preference towards attending to faces and objects that exhibit biological motion, so like the motion of animals. And human babies show similar innate priors. They attend more to faces and other organisms with biological motion. And indeed, humans likely share many innate priors with other animals. It's challenging to investigate these predispositions in humans, given the difficulty of controlling for experience after birth. But there's evidence that soon after birth, human infants have some understanding of things like solidity, occlusion, geometry, physical danger, and other things. The general lesson that I'd like to draw here is that innate priors are crucial for scaffolding learning and other abilities in both humans and other animals. Once generally oriented in the right direction, babies and chicks can learn to distinguish and prefer more specific stimuli. Thus, the role of innate behavioral programs in producing behavior are much more complex than portrayed by the standard view. And just to give make a final point along these lines, even in canonical examples of purported inflexible behavior determined by innate behavioral programs, even these canonical examples have been found to be more complicated than traditionally described. For example, the animal behavior scientist Alexis Breen and colleagues note that, quote, public and scholarly consensus holds that bird nests are achieved by instinct alone. However, after reviewing almost 150 years of data on the avian nest building, they conclude that a variety of forms of learning are involved in nest building, including social learning or observing other birds. Another canonical example of a purported rigid innate behavioral program is web building in spiders. However, there is now evidence showing that spiders adjust their web design based on both long-term web building experiences and recent experiences capturing prey. So they adjust in response to variation in the environment. Finally, other hardwired or innate behaviors such as mating and fighting are known to be highly variable. So innate behavioral programs understood as rigid and inflexible mechanisms leading to predetermined behaviors do not appear to be common, if they exist at all. As the scientist Orsollo Rosasalva and colleagues write with respect to social predispositions, quote, in a world rich in stimuli, social predispositions help young animals direct their attention and learning towards social partners, which provides protection and guidance, and to ignore less relevant stimuli. Predispositions are not fixed and immutable mechanisms, though, but respond in different ways to the environmental and social stimulation present at specific time points during the ontogenetic development. Okay, so why is all of this important? It's important to recognize how we conceptualize animal minds. In particular, to recognize when the categories we have historically employed are no longer appropriate. We can think of these concerns in terms of the observational bias known as the streetlight effect. Illustrated by the following anecdote, the streetlight effect says, imagine you come across someone searching for their keys under a streetlight. You offer to help the person search for their keys, and when after some time you can't find the keys, you ask, are you sure that you lost them here? The person replies, no, they lost their keys elsewhere, but they're searching here because this is where the light is. Similarly, searching for intelligence under the streetlight of our traditional concept of intelligence as human-like and distinct from mechanical processes may severely limit our understanding of the diverse forms that intelligence takes across the animal kingdom. If we'd like to genuinely understand the kinds of intelligence that are found on Earth and possibly elsewhere, I think, and others agree and are arguing something similar, we must adopt a different approach towards mapping this space. And that leads me to the new approach. So one proposal for how we might conceptualize this space. So animals are incredibly diverse, and it's a big question of whether there are conceptual frameworks that might help us systematically understand and organize the space of possible minds. Our current project is called the Major Transitions in the Evolution of Cognition, and we argue for such a framework for conceptualizing the space of animal minds. So this framework is currently being developed with researchers here at the University of Cambridge and with researchers in Australia, particularly the neuroethologist Andrew Barron at Macquarie University and the philosopher Colin Klein at the Australian National University. We argue that one important piece of the puzzle involves treating the evolution of cognition as a series of major transitions. Each transition involved a qualitative change in information flow within nervous systems. Each transition also opened up new cognitive capacities while transforming the power and scope of existing cognitive functions. Understanding these transitions, we argue, shows how cognition evolved and provides the framework we need to comprehend different kinds of intelligence today. Okay, so let me introduce now the Major Transitions framework. Some of you may be familiar with major transitions in evolution. This was a proposal by John Maynard Smith and Ernst Thupmary in the 1990s that received a lot of traction in evolutionary biology. According, and this is in the mid-1990s, and it's continued today. There's been a lot of discussion on this. According to Smith and Thupmary, major transitions in evolution include a host of changes, often including new levels of biological organization. And I've listed some examples here on this slide. Also, the consequences of a transition are profound for both the organism and the biosphere. And it's important to note that major transitions are more than just evolutionary novelties. Smith and Thupmary emphasized several features of major transitions, that they're contingently irreversible, they increase centralized hierarchical control, they enhance the division of labor in a system, and they open up new ways of transmitting information. So we don't need to follow the original major transitions framework exactly. And indeed, there's much discussion in philosophy of science about how best to understand and define a major transition. And we're currently trying to think about how to even define a major transition in cognitive evolution. So that's an ongoing work. But as the philosophers Brett Calcutt and Kim Sterelny point out, quote, the major transitions model is heuristically powerful, for it forces us to ask important questions about the conditions of change and the stability of those conditions. So we think this is a really useful approach for thinking about the evolution of cognition and how you could get what could lead to a major transitions, what they are, and why they're stable evolutionarily. So we propose, and this is, again, ongoing research, but our initial proposal is that there are 5 major transitions in cognitive evolution. And so what I'm going to do here is I'll just describe a few of them so that you can get a sense of how they work. So to start with, let me just note that neurotransmitters like dopamine and epinephrine are found widely across the biological world. So they're not unique to animals. They play really important roles in microorganisms, plants, as well as animals. However, and this is one of our proposed transitions, An important stage in the evolution of cognition was the development of decentralized nervous systems, or when organisms started using neurons to accelerate communication between different parts of their body. Neural networks such as these are found in organisms like the starlet sea anemone and the box jellyfish. Such networks can support several forms of learning: simple associations, sensitization, and habituation. The presence of such networks allows coordinated action and the ability to modulate action by environmental demands. So for example, the jellyfish can hunt in the sense of orienting towards stimuli and changing direction. In this case, however, there is no centralized decision system. Steering, for example, is mediated by the body wall. It's worth highlighting that networks can exist in many different forms. So for example, electrical, chemical, or biophysical. But as animals get bigger, operating speed and preservation of signal over distance becomes more and more important. Smaller bodies can rely on passive diffusion of molecules, but these techniques are slow and spatially limited. Multicellular organisms need faster means of communication if they're going to enable the organism to react to its environment in a meaningful time frame. Here, the important advances made possible by the development of a network of neurons is clear. If we go back to the Ediacaran 635 to 545 million years ago, jellyfish-like organisms were the most complex animal. The pinnacles of cognition at this time were simple coordination and decentralized learning. At this time, it's also likely that relatively simple neural topologies like networks were crucial for the adaptability and evolvability of large-bodied mobile animals. So there's evolutionary evidence and evidence from current animals to suggest that this may be a major transition. Okay, and I think I have time to go over the other two I wanted to briefly mention. So centralization is another major transition that we're proposing. Organisms with this cognitive architecture would include nematode worms like C. elegans, flatworms, leeches, and simple mollusks. Here we have integrated rather than decentralized feed-forward information flow. There's also a radical transformation in sensory motor abilities. So centralization enables specialized senses like eyes and specialized limbs like legs. These enable radical new forms of engagement with the environment. Inputs from specialized senses are combined, and decision systems can use this integrated information as input into other systems. Centralized coordination such as this would enable complex and varied forms of movement. And this can be compared to the feed-forward neural network. So a cognitive architecture of this kind, centralization, is like a feed-forward neural network, where information is processed in one direction, and there are no feedback connections in which the outputs of the network are fed back to itself. Feed-forward networks, despite this architecture, are very powerful for learning and are often used in classification tasks. Similarly, we expect organisms with feed-forward centralization to be able to engage in abilities like second-order conditioning, multimodal learning, extrapolation, and generalization. Just going to check on the dog. Okay. So nervous systems that enable specialized senses and specialized bodies, namely what we're calling centralization, are thought to have emerged in the Cambrian period around 500 million years ago. Such systems made possible mobile active predation and sophisticated predator evasion by prey. In other words, life got big, fast, variable, and complex at this time. The Cambrian period also saw an explosion of animal body plans, notably featuring complex limbs, different types of limbs, and complex sensory systems. The researchers Simona Ginsberg and Eva Jablonka argue that centralization of nervous systems at this time led to a massive increase in adaptive behaviors, such as habitat selection and niche construction. In other words, the move from network to centralization transformed the space of biological possibility, leading to the emergence of great biological diversity, according to Ginsberg and Jablonka, and we agree. Just going to adjust this window. So a centralized network is feed-forward, as we've seen. A recurrent network incorporates feedback from later stages into earlier processing, and this is another transition, we argue, another important evolutionary transition in cognition. And insects are a paradigm example of this. Insect brains show recurrence at multiple levels of processing. We argue that this is the reason why insects like bees are capable of prodigious feats of learning, navigation, working memory, and planning. And I should note that Andrew Barron, who's the neuroethologist on the projects, works with bees. Recent work on insect connectomes also emphasizes the degree to which they are dominated by recurrent loops, and that these aren't present in other organisms like C. elegans. Organisms with recurrent structures similar to the insect mushroom body, such as the mantis shrimp, also have sophisticated capacities for spatial memory, navigation, and visual recognition. So you find the same pattern in cognitive architecture in these two organisms that are capable of similar behavioral, have similar behavioral capacities. Now, it's not known whether this structure has been phylogenetically conserved across the arthropods and crustaceans, that is insects and crustaceans, or whether the mantis shrimp and insects independently underwent a major transition. So that's not known, but in either case, we do think this constitutes a major transition in evolution. So what's important for our purposes is that recurrent architectures do introduce again, radically new forms of learning and behavior and new evolutionary possibilities. And one thing that's worth flagging is that recurrence is not just feedback of any kind. So even unicellular and non-neural systems have a form of feedback through the inevitable consequences of actions on their local environment. Recurrent systems, however, incorporate the output of later stages of processing into earlier stages of processing to change the operation of the system. One benefit of this kind of internalized feedback is that it can speed up the operating timeframe of the network. This offers many advantages for coordination and learning compared to the slower, less reliable feedback that can be gained by just observing the environment and deducing the consequences of one's actions from that. Okay, so the transitions approach, we think, avoids framing cognitive diversity in terms of complex versus simple or clever versus killjoy explanations of cognition. We think it's important to move away from such polarized framings. Simple architectures can give rise to complex behaviors, and complex architectures face their own challenges in functionality and stability. Binary framings lead us to overlook the rich diversity of forms that intelligent behavior can take, as well as encourage anthropocentric tendencies to equate sophisticated capacities with those exhibited by humans. The approach proposed here, we hope, avoids such dichotomies, rather than asking whether humans are exceptional in their capacities for things like episodic memory, causal reasoning, etc. It starts with basic neural mechanisms and identifies the kinds of behaviors that these mechanisms can generate. and what changes are required for new behaviors to emerge. So in conclusion, currently comparative cognition, some might argue, looks a bit like biology before phylogenetics or chemistry before the periodic table. We lack a framework within which to make sense of differences across organisms. Understanding major transitions in cognitive evolution may provide the principles we need to systematically explore this space. The ultimate aim of the Major Transitions Project, the kind of ideal, is to provide a framework that explains large-scale patterns in cognitive evolution while capturing life's immense diversity. Dmitry Mendeleev developed the periodic table, and this periodic table of elements transformed chemical research by providing a framework for capturing both quantitative, such as weight, and qualitative, such as the difference between a metal and a gas, properties of chemical elements. Mendeleev's framework further facilitated discovery by predicting the properties and behaviors of elements yet to be discovered. Similarly, we intend the Major Transitions framework to relate individual species in a way that systematically captures their qualitative and quantitative properties. If this framework is successful, then it will provide not only a new way to understand the bounds and dynamics of cognitive complexity across the tree of life, but also hopefully serve as a foundation for discovery. So I hope you'll go away from this talk with kind of two main take-home messages. First, there's no neat divide between intelligent behavior on the one hand and mechanistic behaviors on the other. And there's no neat mapping of intelligent behaviors onto one set of mechanisms and unintelligent behaviors onto another set of mechanisms. Second, major transitions in cognitive evolution may provide an alternative framework for understanding cognition across the tree of life. That's what we're exploring, and I hope it works out, and I look forward to hearing what you think. Thank you very much for joining us. And now I should mention that, so now it's Q&A time. So if you have any questions, my understanding is that you should just go ahead and put them in the chat and we can discuss them. So I'll stop sharing my slides. Oh, sorry, I was looking at the wrong chat. So not the Q&A chat. So Peter has, okay, so there are a few questions coming in. So Peter asks, how would you place the evolution of language in this framework? So that's a great question. I don't know if I can share my, yeah, I'll just go ahead and talk without sharing the slides. But if you were to go back and look at the diagram with the 5 major transitions, one of the transitions, the 2 transitions that I didn't discuss are lamination and reflection. So it was network, centralization, recurrence, lamination, reflection. And we do identify language as a crucial element of a major transition, namely that of reflection. And we're thinking of reflection in a computer science sense of being able to change your own source code. So the idea is that something like language and mathematics allows humans to change the way they reason about the world. So you change your cognitive architecture in a way, well, not in a way, you change your cognitive architecture by using language and things like mathematics. And so we do think that's absolutely crucial. It's the one, so we're more kind of grounded in biology, animal cognition research, and neuroscience, and so have explored that less, but there are other people working in that area, and so we hope to draw on their research to develop it further. I should just note that there is, I guess just one thing to note about all of these transitions, which I didn't note in the talk, is that they do, the way I presented them might look like a hierarchy, like you just get better and better. But the idea is that with each major transition, you also lose things. And so it's not just progression, it's cumulative in that it is a bit of it's a nested hierarchy in that you need a network before you get centralization. But once you have centralization, you are capable of some things, but also not capable of other things that you might have been capable of while just having a network. Okay, so David Armstrong asks, what is lamination? Yes, and that's something, the other transition that I didn't discuss. We're thinking of this as a recurrence on multiple levels that feeds into different levels in different ways. So it's kind of like recurrence, but you have multiple levels, and it's feeding back into different parts of the system. So it's not just one mechanism feeding back into that same mechanism, but across mechanisms. So that's roughly how we're understanding lamination. And the term lamination comes from thinking of laminated structures in things like the neurocortex in vertebrates. But this is a computational architecture, so it's not just based on, you don't have to have a laminated structure in order to engage in lamination. So for example, with the brains of birds, which are structured differently, you still can have similar cognitive function. So you can have lamination without that laminated neurophysiology. I'm happy to talk about that some more though. So David Hullen asks, does your model enable experimentally testable predictions? Yes, that's absolutely crucial to the project. And that's a great question, because when you have a kind of high-level conceptual framework, I mean, you can account for a lot of phenomena, but I mean, in my own view, prediction is absolutely crucial to show that your account is not just kind of ad hoc and accommodating what you know is out there, but that it can help you understand new phenomena. And exactly what I mentioned with respect to the periodic table, serve as a heuristic for discovery, telling you what to look for. So I do think predictions are central. So we are currently engaging in studies that do test predictions between vertebrates and insects. So if it is the case that insects are like bees are best understood in terms of recurrence, and vertebrates, and we're looking at hummingbirds, if they're best understood in terms of lamination, then this provides some differences in terms of what they're capable of, or provides predictions regarding differences in their learning abilities. So for example, you would expect, or we expect, that in the case of lamination, you are able to learn over greater time periods. So you're able to associate, for example, events over greater time spans. And so you would expect in a similar situation in which you are forming an association over a short time span versus a longer time span, that honeybees should show difficulty with the longer time spans, whereas hummingbirds should not. So that's an example of some of the predictions that the framework makes. But it's important to work out the details so that you can make more predictions. And I think it's really useful to draw on AI there, because you can look at some of these artificial architectures and what they are and aren't capable of, and make predictions about what animals are and are not capable of based on hypotheses concerning their architectures. Okay. So David Burke asks, are you getting anything useful from work of Peter Godfrey Smith, for example, the Metazoa book? So actually, the Metazoa book, you can't see it because I have it in the background, but I haven't read it yet, but I'm a huge fan of Peter Godfrey Smith's work. So he's focusing on the evolution of consciousness. But that's actually what Eva Jablonka and Simona Ginsberg also focus on, the evolution of consciousness. And they link the evolution of consciousness to major transitions. So they are trying to make a case for, for consciousness, which they understand as something called unlimited associative learning as a major transition. So that's just to say that so there are links to the evolution of consciousness with major transitions that some researchers make. But Godfrey Smith focuses on the evolution of consciousness. So yeah, what would we draw on there? So Godfrey Smith, I guess one difference between our approaches is that he, in talking about the evolution of consciousness, he does present it as more gradualist, in that he has an account of how you go from, from proprioception, so understanding or being able to sense as a body, to more complex cognition, or like levels or kinds of consciousness. But it's not spelled out in terms of a major transition. So I think we would actually have to do some work to incorporate his ideas on the evolution of consciousness as major transition, if it is at all. But it's a useful contrast case, actually. So if Godfrey Smith is telling a gradualist story, then that would challenge us to say, how can we understand his account in terms of major transitions? Is it a competing theoretical account that then doesn't allow us to, or is it's not helpful to have these larger categories? I should say that I presented this work to Godfrey Smith, and he did seem on board with the general project. So he seems to be open to the idea that cognition can be understood within a major transitions framework. So we'll just have to see how that works with respect to the consciousness research, which is not what we've focused on yet, but which is a rich area of study. Daryl Francis asks, what are the implications of these biological observations for the development of AI? That is a great question. So I, as I noted in response to a previous question, I do think it's incredibly fruitful that, there's more interaction between AI researchers and comparative cognition researchers now than there has been in the past. And part of that is because of the progress that AI research has made in the last two decades, especially the last decade. So so there's more interaction there. So for example, some of the researchers at DeepMind have developed models that capture our understanding of the physical world. So we have intuitions, for example, if we're looking at a stack of blocks, where the stack of blocks will fall if they're unstable. And they've built a model that makes similar predictions to what humans make regarding how to, regarding our ability to make predictions about physical systems. And I think that's incredibly fruitful because it gives us a formal model for understanding what we take to be, complex cognition that is really difficult to grasp. But if we can develop a formal model, we could find out, actually, kind of going with the theme of this talk, it might not be that complicated or sophisticated. Perhaps there is a model that can capture our intuitions in a very reliable way. So on the one hand, models in AI can help us understand behavior and the mechanisms underlying the behavior and whether they actually are simple or complex. And on the other hand, animal cognition research, and this speaks to your question, more can inform developments in AI, because if our account is right, then certain capacities like recurrence should allow certain forms of learning and certain abilities to interact with the environment. So there would be implementing that in AI should lead to those behaviors. I mean, there's a lot of other structure, of course, that supports a system, and organisms are very complicated. But if we could distill it down to what aspects of the mechanisms are important for like a certain type of learning, then that should feed into AI. And this is, again, something that AI researchers have been saying. There's a paper by Demis Hassabis and colleagues talking about neuroscience-inspired AI, where they explicitly say, like, psychology and neuroscience are incredibly helpful for AI development. And they give examples like even reinforcement learning, that the central concept of reinforcement learning in AI was initially developed in animal cognition studies, and then was refined and developed further in AI. And then it turns out that actually animal researchers have gone back and taken those developed models of reinforcement learning and then applied them back to animals. So a lot of exciting back and forth. Oh gosh. First of all, Peter says, thank you, fascinating. Thank you, appreciate that. And then an anonymous attendee asks, what is the time frame for each of these major transitions? And that is a great question. So we do think it's useful to think of networks as the dominant architecture in the Ediacaran period, and centralization as emerging in the Cambrian period. But we don't have timelines for the other transitions. If going back to one of the earlier questions, if reflection is grounded in the ability to use language and symbols, then you might be able to locate it there. I think that's all I can say on that. With Eva Jablonka and Simona Ginsberg, they do talk about several transitions happening in quick succession during the Cambrian period. So they don't necessarily have to be spaced out over hundreds of millions of years. But I think that's a great question and to be determined. But we would want to do that. We would want to actually locate it in evolutionary history, even though it might have happened multiple times. So a major transition doesn't have to happen once, but it has to meet certain conditions to count as a major transition, even if it occurred in different taxa at different times. Okay, another question, anonymous attendee asks, are the changes largely anatomical, or do biochemical changes occur simultaneously? That's a good question. I haven't looked at that, but when we talk about what biochemical changes would be required for any change in cognitive architecture. When we talk about cognitive architecture, we are talking about it in a more abstract sense of the ability to process information in a certain way. And that will be multiply realized in different anatomical capacities. So you could have different ways, different nervous systems, an organization of neurons actually achieving recurrence on an information processing level. So I should just point out that though the anatomy can serve as a clue for what kind of cognitive architecture is at play, given how we know the anatomy works in terms of information processing, it won't just map one-to-one onto one kind of anatomical structure. And then in terms of biochemistry, Yeah, that's a difficult question. So I think it'll just depend on, and this is why I say I'm not sure, because it'll depend on the case. Because organisms, in my understanding, are incredibly good at recruiting different biochemical elements to succeed in some task. So, for example, circadian rhythms, our ability to maintain a sleep-wake cycle, that can be, again, achieved in different ways and is achieved in different ways across different organisms. But when you understand it in one organism, like the mouse, for example, you can make predictions about what kind of biochemistry to look for. So you look for something similar in, for example, the fruit fly, because this is what you found maintains circadian rhythms in the mouse. And when you look at this research, you find that often biologists are quite surprised by what they find. So they'll look at the fruit fly and say, well, actually, this protein, this enzyme is doing something completely different in the fly than it is in the mouse. But it still serves as a heuristic for discovery. So once you kind of know what to look for, you can go examine like that protein, find it's not doing the job you expected it to do based on what it's doing in the mouse, and then look for something else that can do that job, or look to see what job that protein is doing, what's its function, in order to see if maybe it's playing a different role in that same biological mechanism. So I think it's just complicated, but once you have, a broad framework, but also once you start to understand how it works in particular model organisms, then that can serve as a guide for understanding other organisms, even if those other organisms are different, and do the thing differently than your model organism. Thank you. And I think we've reached the end of our time. So I just want to say, thank you everyone for coming. And please feel free to email me. Again, I'm Marta Helena in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, if you have any further questions or want to chat about this topic. Thanks, and have a good Sunday.